I'm Marcel, and welcome to me screaming into the void, mostly about books. This is my wrap-up for September 2024, and it has not been the best reading month. With that said, I don't mean I haven't read a ton of books. Last September, I was just doing Shorty September, and I had a project of trying to read one book each day, and I managed that, and it drove me insane. Reading that many books in that short a time without being able to talk about it and process it. And I haven't counted. It wouldn't surprise me if I actually have read 30 books this month as well. But the reason why things haven't been the best this month is that I've been doing two readathons. One is a Shorty September, and the other one is a romance readathon. And the reason I'm doing the romance readathon is that I am doing a project where I'm trying to read romance books to figure out what is romance. Why do people read romance? Is romance a genre I would enjoy if I just read the right type of romance? I have a video on my channel with my first thoughts about reading it. I made it after reading 10 books. I've now read a lot more, and I do have planned at least 3 more videos based on that project, even if I haven't read all. I had a project, I'm going to read 50 books, so that's more than just 1 month. And in general, I am now understanding more and more the romance genre as a wish fulfillment genre. But I still want to sort of read all of the 50 books that I said I was going to read. So the problem, of course, was then combining these two readathons, and I did a bad job of doing that. What I should have done if I had planned this a bit better is that I'd pick romance books for Shorty September, which I didn't. So I was always drawn between should I read for this romance project and romance readathon, which is a point-based readathon, where you sort of get points based on how many romance books you read, or should I read towards Shorty September and the books that are there. So it was sort of, I felt guilty every time I picked up a book because I was just thinking about the other readathon that I was not fulfilling, and that's not a good feeling to have. So if I could do this month again, I probably would have planned a better way of integrating those two readathons and picking less what do I already have on the shelf and more what romance short books can I do for Shorty September that could also fit into the romance project. But I did read some of the books. I have not read all of the books I said I was going to do for Shorty September. I knew I wasn't going to read all of the books for the romance project, but I didn't manage to read all of them for Shorty September, and I feel bad about that because, yeah, that's my type of personality. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to have these go for the next month as well. So the books that I did not read was Short with Pockets. So for those who do not know about Shorty September, you read short books. This was created by Pistori. And then you have certain prompts. This year the theme was tarot cards, in addition to shorts being a theme. So we had 12 prompts that we were going to read, and I didn't read 3 of them. And the 3 I didn't read that I'm then going to read next month in addition to all of the books I'm going to read next month, is Yi Sang Wings. And this was for read a book with something on the cover that could fit in a pocket. And I was really looking forward to reading this one because this was a Korean book written before Korea was divided into North and South. And another one that I didn't manage to read was Planet of Exile by Ursula Le Guin. And I've really wanted to read more from Ursula Le Guin as a science fiction and fantasy queen. And this was for George to read something from the 70s or 80s. And Sulpicia and her poetry collections. And this was micro Taylor Swift shorts. Read a poetry book or read a book with a breakup in it. So this is a poetry book from one of the few female Roman poets that we have. For those who are in Norway, I am reading the Canon translations. I have several of their books and I'm very happy with their translation. I haven't read this one, but I'm in general very happy with the translations, that one. So those are the three that I'm now going to have to go to next month because I said I was going to read it, so I am going to read it. And now I'm going to show you the books that I did read. So this is, of course, a wrap-up. I already did a halfway point. So these are sort of the books I've read in the second half of the month. And for the book, buy a book and read it. Bonus points if you get it in a paper bag, because this was paper bag shorts. I did sadly not get it in a paper bag, but this is Agatha Christie, Porcupine Investigates. And this started off as a book that I fell in love with because Porcupine is another personality that Agatha Christie has created. He has worked with statistics, and the book starts with Porcupine putting into sort of the sphere of if you are unhappy, contact Porcupine. And then people come with him and they are unhappy, and then he uses statistics to solve their unhappiness. So a woman who is unhappy because she is bored, he will figure out, well, why are statistically women in this age group bored, and then he will just fix the problem. And I so enjoyed it because, I mean, a lot of her work is very psychological oriented. So Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot is also psychological driven characters. But this was sort of a different way of doing it, and a very sort of more sort of honest in a sense. He talks more openly about the psychology that drives him. And the start especially, I mean, later in the book he sort of starts going off and becoming a more traditional detective. But the first stories are very interesting in the sense that it's an original way of discussing certain psychological factors. For example, why do we get bored? Why do we want to cheat? And I loved reading about her thoughts about that. And I felt that by reading this book, I understood more of the psychological aspects that I think she built a lot of her other books on, because this was quite early in her career. So, and then I have Supermarket 2-pack short bundle, read a non-fiction book that ties in with another of your shorties. And I read César Ayara's An Episode in a Traveling Painter's Life and A Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire. So it's not the same Césaire. So this is a fictional book about a retelling of something that happened to a German painter when he was in Argentina, where he had an accident where his entire face was disfigured. And what sort of the book was about was more how he kept a quite an optimistic view on life, but everyone else changed their view on him. So he wasn't necessarily changed, but everyone else reacted differently to him because of that. And what this book is, Discourse on Colonialism, this is an essay by Aimé Césaire. He is from Martinique. I think it's, I'm trying to very quickly see, no, it's not on the back, but I think it's Martinique. It's one of the French colonies in Africa. Written in the late 50s, so in the 50s, so the late 50s. It was written after 55. But it was written after World War II, and it was a way of trying to show how the ideas of the Nazis didn't necessarily sort of come out of nowhere, that there is something very similar to the Nazis' ideas that you can see in how colonies treated their colonies. So so there is something very similar about the ideas of Nazism to the ideas of having colonies. So it's very clear that he's not talking about two cultures meeting. That's fine. But there is something exploitative about the idea of having colonies, and that you can see that within also Nazism. And so the reason why I sort of wanted to talk about that is because Argentina wasn't, of course, a German colony, but this book does sort of point towards how cultures do interact. And the fact that this painter was German is not really talked about in this book. So it just happens to, well, this thing happened to this German painter, and he just happens to be German. So it's more sort of about how his disfigurement changes other people's relationship to him, about him. But it still talks about intercultural meetings. Then I read Homecoming by Louise M. Gauche. This is the only romance book in Shorty September that I've read. And read a book and pair it with a song or an album. So I read this book and I paired it with Christian music. And there was something about the book that I did enjoy having that paired together, in the sense that the book very much is about her devotion to her now husband and her sort of out of sorts with everything else. This book is sort of a sequel. I did not know it was a sequel when I brought it up, with a couple who were married when they were quite young, had a son, then got divorced, and drifted away, and on each side found Christianity. He became a multimillionaire doing football. And then in the first book they found together. And then this book is actually what happened after the wedding. In a sense, what happens after that. And I did like what they're sort of reflecting on with how it's not easy to keep changed. So it's easy in a sense to change, but it's very easy to change back. So it's a very clearly Christian book. So it did fit with the music and everything like that. And then the last one of these that I read in this half, and then I also read a few in the halfway, is Vollensmith from Grimsby. And this was Smith of Wootton Major, which is in English. But this was Zip Off Trousers. Read a book with a title that could be shorter. And this book is a fairy tale. It's one of sort of J.R.R. Tolkien fairy tales about a man who gets a stone from a fairy and how that stone transports him into another world. And this version has this sort of beautiful illustrations, and I did enjoy that. And it's a classic fairy tale, and what I really enjoyed with reading this is that it sort of shows how much influence that J.R.R. Tolkien had in changing the fantasy genre. Because this fairy tale, while this is also very much meant towards children, it's a children's book, but it also has a lot of influence from early fantasy, so the fantasy pre-J.R. Tolkien, which is almost its own genre. So you can sort of see how much he is influenced by the earlier fantasy genre, especially regarding this fairy tale fantasy world that you are dragged into or enter without knowing it, and things happening and then traveling back. So for those who enjoy fairy tales. So those were the books that I read for Shorty September. And I enjoyed all of the books, and I'm just sorry that I couldn't sort of get more involved with that. So what have I then been involved with, if not for Shorty September? Well, we are doing this romance project. And I've been doing this while being on the Romance Readathon. It's a readathon that is inspired by Phantom of the Opera. So there is, it's team-based. I have been on Team Raoul. I know how to say his name. Raoul. I've been on Team Raoul. And I've simply just been reading a lot of romance books. So the romance books that I have been reading. So I'm going to talk more about the project, the analyzing, my thoughts, feelings in other books. Now I'm just talking about the books themselves. For the first book I want to talk about is The Cheat Sheet by Sarah Adams. This is about two childhood friends who, one is a multimillionaire because he became a football player. I don't understand how I managed to find two books with that plot in a month, but there you are. And it's a very sort of traditional friends to lovers scenario, with a lot of humor, especially when it came to sort of the male main character and his friends, who are doing absurd things to try to sort of win her over. Then I also read An Extraordinary Union by Alyssa Cole, which is about, it's an historical romance about a black woman and a white Scottish man who are spies during the Civil War and trying to end slavery. And this is probably one of the romance books that I enjoyed the most of all the romance books that I've read. The way that Alyssa Cole, describes these characters, and I'm not necessarily just talking about the black woman, but I'm equally talking about the white Scottish man, who is, of course, betraying a white Confederate soldier as a part of his being a spy, and the way that he sort of reflects on why his family sort of being persecuted in Great Britain because they are Scottish, by the English. So the English persecuted the Scottish, so the Scottish travelled to the US, and then suddenly being in a position of privilege, so travelling from non-privilege to privilege. And the interesting reflections that he has on that understandably weird situation is wonderful. Her way of describing these characters are so amazing. And I read another of her books earlier this month that I talked about in the other video. It was A Princess in Theory. And it's interesting because A Princess in Theory, I mean, it was fine. It was a classic fairy tale retelling. But of course, being a fairy tale retelling, the characters were kind of one-dimensional. They served a specific purpose. So I wouldn't actually have guessed that these two books were written by the same author, because they were so wildly different types of books. Then I read two books by Eva Lee. I first read Would I Lie to the Duke, which is about a poor businesswoman in the 1800s who is fooling a bunch of noble people to thinking that she is noble so that she can get them to invest in her business. And this was actually book number 2 in the series. And the first book in the series is My Fake Rake, which is about a rich noblewoman who has to transform a man who is nouveau rich. So his family is rich, but he doesn't have a title. He doesn't have sort of nobility. He doesn't really have anything. He just has a lot of money. So she has to imbue him with teaching him how to be a rake, my fake rake, a rake, which is a man who's suave and who goes around and chats up everyone, because in the 1800s she needs a man because she is not allowed to be single. So these two, so the book number 1 is actually referenced to in book number 2. So if I'd known that, I would have switched them around. And these are absolutely fun historical romps that do sort of put into the center how women did not have certain rights throughout history. Then I read A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Fasail, and I was a bit confused because I picked this book as my representation for fantasy romance, and I'm not really sure it should count as a romance. It's about this woman who is an immigrant and who has a tea house, which at night becomes a blood house where vampires come and can drink blood. And she is then forced to do a heist and have to sort of gather a crew. But the romance was sort of, I thought the romance was actually a bit lacking in this one. And and that is of course a problem with reading a book purely for the romance. So I don't really know if I would have felt differently about this book if I had not read it for the romance. So this book is probably incredibly interesting. I did like the heist, interesting characterizations, but the romance was lacking. So that was what I was focusing on. Then I read the quiz. quiz. Then I read The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang. This was my representation for a seduction romance. So it was focusing, it's a romance book focusing on the seduction. And this is a woman who has autism who hires, I think he is considered a sex worker, to teach her how to have sex, because as a woman with autism she doesn't really know about that, and she is getting pressured to get married, and to get married you need to date, and to date you need to have sex. There is two things that I was sort of questioning regarding this book, and one of them has to do with the autism. I know that the autism in this book has been very much debated, and I do know that Helen Huang is, what I read was that she is autistic herself. And then you can also always discuss, just because that person is autistic, that doesn't necessarily a good way of sort of saying, well, anything she writes about autism is then okay. But I don't really mind that, and mostly because autism is a spectrum, and autism is just one part of a person's more complex personality. So a book by an autistic author will never necessarily fit all of your criteria as someone with autism. But one thing that I didn't understand about the autism is that the way the character was painted in the beginning was that she had never been interested in physical attraction. She had never been interested in sex, kissing, and that's not necessarily unusual because of heightened sensitivities with touch and stuff like that. There are a lot of autistic people who are asexual. That's just how it is, and that's what I sort of read her as someone who doesn't have sexual desire, but still sort of understands that in everyday society sexual desire is something that is sort of a part of what is expected. And then she sort of became extremely hypersexual with this male escort. And I didn't really understand that. That was, I don't know if anyone else reacted to that total switch that happened. If they sort of had talked about, oh yeah, but she's demisexual, so she has sort of a personal connection to this one. That's why she is sexually attracted to him. That would be fine. That's a form of explanation. But she doesn't really talk about it. She is immediately sexually attracted to him, unlike any other man she has ever met. And I thought that was a bit weird. I don't know. If you've read the book, did you think that was weird, or is that just one romance tropes of it? And the second thing that I also sort of questioned regarding this book was, why did she end up giving away all her money at the end? I mean, it's fine if she's not interested in the money, but why did she then not give it away before the end? I'm not sure I'm making sense. Please tell me if I'm making sense. And if you read the book, please tell me if you've also, if that also was weird. Then I read Jeremiah's Daughter by Samantha Prince. This is an example of Amish romance. So it's about a woman who grew up Amish, who decided to be non-Amish, to leave sort of the Amish culture, and then has to come back to help her family, and then has to decide between an Amish man and a non-Amish man, as a way of talking about should she go back to the Amish culture or not. It was a very, very quick book, absolutely, and there was almost something exotification about it. It was a bit weird in the sense that I've read a bit of Christian books, and I've read a bit of especially Christian romances, for example, but I didn't feel like this was specifically a Christian book. It felt more as a way of fetishizing the Amish and the Amish way of doing things, if that makes sense. I don't know if you've read any Amish romance, if you feel like that's sort of just the point with Amish romance, but I would love to hear more about, if you've read Amish romance, what do you think about it, and if this is just this specific book, or if that's just part of the genre. Talking about Christian books, then I read an inspirational romance, which was Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers. The book is about a former prostitute who marries a farmer, but because she doesn't really feel like she is allowed to be loved, she is very heavily traumatized, started as a sex worker when she was just a child. So she's bringing all of this baggage in, and when this man is saying, I just want to love you, she doesn't really believe him. So she keeps running away, and he keeps bringing her back. And that's the way it goes. And the reason why he keeps bringing her back is because God has said, this is the woman that I give to you. This is the woman you are meant to love, despite that being hard. So this is a book that is very sort of clearly Christian and clearly talking about how when things are tough, you need to do something about it. You can't just sit around and hope that things will fix themselves. You clearly need to be an active agent. But two, do keep having faith in God that will help you in these troubling times. And it was something that was, so despite the sort of the backstory of being a child prostitute, it do sort of delves into something very fundamental about the fear of not being worthy of love. Then I read 3 Holidays and a Wedding by Uzma Yalodin and Marissa Staple. And this is about 2 women, one who grew up in a Christian Jewish household and one woman who grew up Muslim, who is on the same plane, and this plane lands in a small town that is apparently a Christmas town, a very intercultural Christmas town. It was so weird. I loved it. I really, really loved it, but it was so weird. And these 2 women then have parallel stories that sometimes merges, and it's just as much about them being friends as how do they sort of deal with their respective love stories. And in this town that is so interculturally perfect that it became absurd. As someone who works with diversity in her day job, it felt like someone, like, it's not real, but it's so cute. And that's not how it works, but it's a fairy tale. And I loved it. I loved this book. It was not realistic at all, but I loved this book. Oh, and it's in another thing that I also enjoyed is that it's one of the few romance books where you really have female friendship sort of up and center, because you have 2 main female characters. So of course you do have scenes with female characters in a lot of the other books that sort of support the main character, but because you do have 2 female main characters, it's sort of, they interact with one another in a very specific way that is so adorable. So going from something incredibly adorable to my book that was a tearjerker romance book. So a romance book that is meant to make you cry, but does have a happy ending. Debatable. I would say it has a happy ending, but I did see someone saying that this ending just made them cry even more. So if you've read Dust Walker by Tiffany Roberts, please let me know what you think about the ending. So this is a dystopia. So we're in some kind of future where robots have taken over, and it's in a small town, and you have where the robots rules, and a small human woman who is trying to survive. For some reason, gets a robot totally enamored with her, and she falls in love with him, and then they survive. It's quite dark. It has all of the trigger warnings that you sort of can have. It is meant to be a dark book, but it didn't feel like it was a dark book just to be dark. It is a dystopia. It is meant to sort of comment on societies where things aren't okay, and what people are willing to ignore as long as what's not okay is not sort of fitting their own personal journey. And then I started to, so this was sort of book 20 of all of the books that I've picked out for this project. And I started to have certain theories about gender. So I picked all of the books written by male authors. And some of them were on my TBR, some of them were sort of randomly picked. But I read Jamie Ford, A Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. And this is not a romance, this is a love story. And the reason why I'm saying that is because while it does have a happy ending, and while it does sort of feature a romance story at the center of it, it doesn't really fit the romance genre in a sense. And I'll talk about what I mean more about that in another video. But this is a book about a Chinese American in 1942 who falls in love with a Japanese American. And in 1942, the US, considering they were at war with Japan, had internment camps for the Japanese. So the story is about this Chinese American who sees his girlfriend sort of be sent away to these internment camps, is feeling pressure from his own father, who is Chinese immigrant, to not be romantically involved with the Japanese because the Japanese is the root of all evil. And parallel with that, we are talking about the story in the 80s where this man is trying to deal with being a widow in the 1980s and dealing with his son who is interested in a white woman, and the son thinking that that is not something that his father is going to be okay with. I saw an interview, and I don't remember where, and I'm a bit sad that I don't remember where, but it was talking about children of immigrants who talked about how their parents dealt with choices they had made that were different from what their parents probably would have wanted. And one of them stated that I think that we sometimes underestimate our own parents, that our parents are willing to understand more than what we think they would. And this book is such a good example of that. It's such a good example of what do we as children know about what our parents will accept and don't accept. What do we know about the things that they have experienced? Wonderful book. Then I read Daniel Glatauer's Emmy and Leo, and this is actually two books in one, but book number 2 picks up right after book number 1. If you want this to be a romance, so a traditional romance with a happy ending, you need to read both. But there is something more very poignant about where book 1 ends. So if you just want to have a story about a love story, not romance, you can read both, or you can read just one. If you want a romance, you need to read both books. But considering this is both of them, it's not they're not that big. And this is about 2 people who start emailing one another by accident. So one of the people by accident sends one of them an email, and then he responds, and then they start. And the problem then becomes that they are friends, and then this develops into potential more. But she is married, and afterwards he also becomes romantically involved with people. So in the sense, it is a way of sort of, they enjoy each other's company over email, but it doesn't really fit time-wise and all of the things that are happening there. And then I read Victoria by Knut Hamsun. This is about a young man who is a miller's son who falls in love with a nobleman's daughter, and it's sort of throughout their history. And this is one of the things that I find interesting about the romance genre, because this was, of course, written in the late 1800s, 1898 to be precise. And this would fit in the romance genre as a wish fulfillment one, as a way of talking about escapism. Everything you talk about romance today, with the exception of, spoilers, the happy ending. And so the way that they talk about the escapism and the wish fulfillment and everything that we talk about romance today fits this book, but in the time when it was written. So it's more in the vein of the knightly ideas of romance. And the knightly idea of romance, the one you sort of have from the Middle Ages, when romance genre first sort of emerged, is that love is so pure that only death can be its savior. So she dies at the end. But that is the point. That's what keeps the wish fulfillment alive. Getting married and surviving, it's so blessé. That's not true love. True love can never be sort of ruined by the day-to-day. So those were sort of the books I had on my TBR, physical TBR. And then I also had what I called a wild card. I made a video, had sort of a machine explaining why all of these categories. But this one was also written by a man, and it's called Last Summer in the City by Gianfranco Caligeric. And this wouldn't actually be a romance in a sense. I don't really know why it fit into this category. Even a sort of, in some way it sort of fits into this one, and in the sense that romance is pure, but more than that, it almost feels like a fairy tale. So the book is a fairy tale and the romance is just a part of it. So I don't really know why people are sort of saying that this is a brilliant romance book, because the romance isn't such a huge part of the book. But I enjoyed it. It was a wonderful book. Just don't expect a huge romance plot to it. Because I was interested in gender and romance, I reached out to some of the people I am doing the Romance Readathon with and asked for recommendations for romances written by men. I got 14 recommendations. The majority of them are writing queer romance. So that is interesting in and of itself, that most men are writing within the queer romance of the suggestions I was given. But I also read 3 books based on that. I read No One But You by Lee Greenwood, which is a Western romance about a woman who marries someone who can help her run her ranch because she is a widow and cannot do it on her own. And he is large and muscular. I think I was a bit confused about the book because usually in romance there is an issue with the men being large and muscular and very handsome. That's a part of the wish fulfillment. But in No One But You, sometimes they were described as quite hot, sometimes they were described as not hot, but they were immediately sexually attracted to one another. So I don't know. If you've read the book, please let me know. Are they supposed to be hot or not? But it's a fun story, and it was also interesting to see the whole if you are a woman with children dynamic, and the wish fulfillment about your children immediately wanting you to date someone that you are also attracted to. Then I read Danger on Maui by R. Barry Flowers, which is a suspense about an author of true crime who travels to Hawaii and is mixed up with something and has to be saved by a hunky policeman. And she is sexy and he is sexy, and this really much reads like a thriller film but with a much larger romance plot. And then I also read Flowers for the Devil by V. Kahane. And this is a book about I almost said Soviet. It's not Soviet, it's Russian. She's Russian. By a Russian immigrant who is falling in love with a mysterious man at the same time that she is falling in love with a duke who is a part of her social circle. And it's very dark in the sense that there are a lot of dark rooms. Compared to Dustwalker, it's not dark in that sense, but it does sort of talk a bit about social injustice, about how the working class has been exploited, which includes women being exploited. So there are some trigger warnings about sexual abuse in that sense. And I really enjoyed this book. It was so well written, and I was so fascinated by these characters. Sadly, I felt like it was, because there is, of course, a huge mystery in the book, and that is, who is this mysterious man in the dark that she is falling in love with? And I think the book milks that a little too much. They think that this is a bit more interesting and a bit more, or maybe it is, maybe I'm just the one who sort of recognized the pattern or something like that. But other than this sort of, don't we know who this is? Brilliantly written, so well written, with not necessarily just about the characters and how the characters are developed, but also about how they are reflecting on quite a bunch of large topics regarding nobility and class relation, but also about immigration and about women's position in society. So it was I wanted to say it's a heavy story, and it is so kind of a heavy story in one way. It's not complicated, but you need to pay attention. I don't know if that's if that makes sense. So that's all of the books that I've read now in the last 2 weeks. I haven't done anything else. Oh, why does this happen? Why does this happen? And I'm fine. I'm fine. Of course I'm fine. So, what have you read in September? And I know that a lot of people are doing sort of multiple readathons. I'm going to do a multiple readathon next month. But how do you then, if you do multiple readathons, how do you sort of make them fit together or work together? Or do you sort of actively pick readathons that don't go well together, but where that doesn't really matter because they're very short? Or do you sort of struggle the way I did with being very ambitious because you choose readathons and don't think about how they should then work together? Let's talk about readathons in down below, and thank you for listening to me screaming into the void.